So with arteries and veins, the first thing you need to know are the three tunics. As you go from external, superficial to deep towards the lumen, you have the tunica adventitia or tunica externa, as you sometimes see it, the tunica media, and the tunica intima or tunica interna. They, the two outer and inner tunics, will sometimes have alternate names depending on the textbooks you were looking at. So you kind of need to know the constituents of each tunic to understand how they work. The tunica adventitia or externa is uh, relatively tough connective tissue that is really to protect the underlying muscle and epithelia and to anchor the blood vessel in surrounding tissue. The tunica adventitia also contains the vasa vasorum, which is a concept you should understand, as well as nerves. The vasa vasorum are literally vessels for the vessels. They are small blood vessels that feed the muscularis, smooth muscle layer of larger blood vessels. So just like the heart doesn't use the blood, it actually pumps through it. Many blood vessels do not actually use oxygen from the blood, they pump through it. So large blood vessels will have smaller vessels to feed the muscle layers because diffusion does not occur that far. So within the tunica media, you have an elastic membrane that varies in thickness depending on the type of artery you're looking at or vein, and the muscularis or smooth muscle layer that as it constricts will vasoconstrict. As it relaxes, it vasodilates. So this regulates the diameter of the lumen and the amount of blood that flows through that blood vessel. So when you look at tunica intima, the three layers there you have, or the four layers, you have the internal elastic membrane, the lamina propria and the basement membrane, and the endothelia. Now the endothelium you will only see present or when you look at capillaries, the only layer present is the endothelium. So what you're looking at here is a model of a large artery, but as the arteries get smaller, smaller diameter, and eventually you just have the capillary bed, again, you're just looking at the basement membrane and endothelium, basically, because you're looking at gas diffusion across those cells in the capillary bed. Again, the gas diffusion does not occur really across the lamina propria and the internal elastic membrane, so you don't see that in anything beyond in the tunica media or adventitia in capillary beds. So remember, in capillary beds, you're just looking at the endothelial layer. So you should be able to recognize an artery versus a vein in a photomicrograph. The artery labeled A here, as you can see, is nice and round in cross section because of that the dual elastic, the internal and external elastic membranes. As you see, there's those very dark little fibers that are kind of waving back and forth. Again, think of the waistband in your elastic pants when you're not in them. That is bunched up all back and forth. So when that artery expands in volume, that elastic fiber will cause the lumen to recoil back. So again, what you're looking at is a rested artery. Dead, not under tension or anything, but when there's blood passing through that artery would increase in diameter, and those elastic fibers would cause that to recoil back. So that expansion and contraction, recoiling, again, that is basically our pulse wave that we feel as a palpated pulse. The vein, again, if you look, it's kind of flaccid and limp. There's very little blood pressure in a vein, so it has a very thin elastic membrane. You see the tunica media is very thin as well. So the vein is not under the same pressures that the artery is under, so you don't see the same type of structure. For comparing the two, a vein usually, if you could expand it out, would have a larger lumen. But again, you should be able to recognize artery versus vein if you're looking at a photo. So looking at the different types of arteries, again, there is a table in your lab manual that shows the elastic or conducting arteries and what they call the muscular or distributing arteries. Again, those other names will tell you what they do. The elastic arteries, they just conduct. Those are the large arteries from the aorta down to the iliac, the carotids up to the head. So these are large arteries that bring large volumes of blood immediately from the heart, the median of the body out to the periphery of the body. They have a large elastic membrane in the tunica media and a relatively thin, smooth muscle layer. Okay, these vessels are not doing a whole lot of vasoconstriction, vasodilation as to cause blood to be shunted from one area to the other. They are just what they sound like, conducting that blood. And they do have a lot of elastic tissue because, again, they're under a lot of pressure. That elastic tissue, expands out and recoils back. And again, that's our pulse wave that we feel. So as you start getting to smaller arteries, the muscular arteries have a thinner external elastic membrane, but a thicker muscularis or smooth muscle layer, because this is where you see the vasoconstriction, vasodilation, and regulation of blood being shunted from one area to another. When we think about the autonomic nervous system and going to fight and flight, and shunting blood towards the brain and towards the muscle, as opposed to towards the gastrointestinal tract, these are the muscles that will vasoconstrict and vasodilate to regulate flow of blood to different areas of the body. So, I'm not going to focus much on the other types. They just get smaller and smaller. But those two concepts, the elastic slash conducting arteries and the muscular slash distributing arteries, you should kind of understand the difference between those two. So with most of the arteries in these diagrams, most of the diagrams, there are arteries that are highlighted or bolded that you need to know. So here you're looking at the right side of the head. Now in lab, I skipped ahead to the next a few slides. We looked at the actual chest, but we'll just talk about the brachiocephalic artery right now. And that is your first arch vessel. And again, that is a right-sided vessel, which is why you see in this specimen from the right and not the left. So the brachiocephalic artery splits into the subclavian artery. And again, subclavian you need to know. I know that's not bolded, but you need to know that one. The subclavian goes out to the arm. Now, subclavian turns into the axillary, which turns into the brachial. So blood vessels will change name if they branch or if they go to like a different region of the body. Okay, so there's no branching between the subclavian artery and the axillary artery, but it just goes from deep to the clavicle, subclavian, within the thorax, to heading out to the arm in the axillary region under the scapula. So that's where you get the axillary term. And then it turns into the brachial as it crosses over and gets closer to the humerus and actually becomes part of the arm. So you want to know the subclavian artery goes off into the axillary, brachial, and into the arm. So the other branch of the brachiocephalic artery is the common carotid artery. Anytime you see a common, there is going to be some sort of split between that. In this case, it is going to be internal and external. So the common carotid branches into the internal carotid artery, which goes up to deep into the brain, and the external carotid artery, which stays more superficial and feeds the muscles of the skull. So if you're talking about the two, internal it goes into the skull, external does not penetrate the skull. So out of these, those are the arteries you should know. Oh, no, I'm wrong. The vertebral artery. Forgot about that branch. Another branch of the subclavian artery is the vertebral artery. So the vertebral artery, as you see, goes up through the transverse foramina of the cervical vertebrae. If you remember that from last semester, that was one of the characteristics of cervical vertebrae. They all had these little holes within the transverse process. Well, those holes carry the vertebral artery. So we're going to talk about the next slide, which is the cerebral arterial circle, or the circle of Willis, and the two blood inputs into the brain come from the vertebral artery and the internal carotid artery, both which you see here from the right side. So you also need to know the blood vessels of the circle of Willis, sometimes known as the cerebral arterial circle. Again, they're getting away from using proper names here. But let's start at the bottom of this slide, and we'll look at the vertebral arteries. Again, you have left and right vertebral artery. They come together along the brain stem around the area of the medulla and pons to form the basilar artery, and the basilar artery again across the surface of the pons and splits. The basilar artery splits again to form the left and right posterior cerebral arteries. You see kind of following back underneath the temporal and the occipital lobes to the posterior cerebrum. All right, so the vertebral artery comes together to form the basilar artery, which then splits to the posterior cerebral artery. Now, take a look at the other blood input, the internal carotid artery. Basically, as soon as it passes that branch point, that internal carotid artery is referred to as the middle cerebral artery, and goes and feeds as you can see there, there's part of that cutoff of the temporal lobe, so it goes to the frontal and kind of the parietal lobes between the frontal or between the temporal lobe and the parietal. So the internal carotid goes straight into the middle cerebral, but you see there's two branches of the internal carotid artery. One branch kind of goes anterior and forms the anterior cerebral artery that goes up to the frontal lobe. Again, left and right. Now, bridging that left and right anterior cerebral artery is the anterior communicating artery. And the communicating arteries are the ones that connect to just two different blood flows, and they create some redundancy in blood flow to the brain. It should make sense. You want a little bit of redundancy when you're talking about blood flow to the brain. So that if blood is blocked one area, you can get blood to it from another pathway. But the anterior communicating artery connects the anterior cerebral arteries left and right. And if you look at the other branch of the internal carotid artery, it is the posterior communicating artery. There's a left and right posterior communicating artery that connects the blood circuit that is fed from the internal carotid artery to that blood circuit we just looked at that is fed to from the vertebral artery. So the posterior communicating artery connects the internal carotid with the posterior cerebral artery just past the branch where they split from the basilar. Again, we kind of looked at this as a kind of a schematic in lab. So just kind of be able to tell me about the circle of Willis. And again, we got two blood inputs: internal carotid artery and vertebral artery, and three blood outputs. We have the anterior cerebral artery, the middle cerebral artery, and the posterior cerebral artery. And then again, connecting kind of those two different blood inputs, the posterior communicating arteries left and right connects the vertebral artery circuit to the internal carotid artery circuit, and then anterior we have the anterior communicating artery connects the left internal carotid circuit to the right internal carotid circuit. So again, you see that circle of Willis is centered around where the pituitary gland and the optic chiasm sit deep within the brain, just anterior to the pons. So be able to label the circle of Willis. So looking at the aorta and some of the major branches in the thorax and abdomen, we have the ascending aorta, again as it goes up. Again, the first two branches are the left and right coronary arteries, which you really don't see here just on the surface of the heart. But the first arch vessel of the aortic arch is the brachiocephalic trunk, brachiocephalic artery. Brachiocephalic trunk splits into the right subclavian and the right common carotid arteries. Again, subclavian going out to the arm and the common carotid going to the head and the brain and skull. The next arch vessel is the left common carotid artery, and the third arch vessel is the left subclavian artery. All right, so the left side has their own individual arch vessels. Remember, the right side comes off of a common brachiocephalic artery. And again, you think of the name, brachiocephalic is literally arm, head. So you have the arch of the aorta as it turns 180 degrees, then the descending aorta through the thorax. As soon as it passes the diaphragm, it is again known as the abdominal aorta, and the major splits there at the distal abdominal aorta are for the left and right common iliac arteries. Your textbook has the celiac trunk and its three branches. You should know that as well. The left gastric, the splenic, and the common hepatic. So you see those here, but we'll look at them in other diagrams as well. Okay, so the vessels you want to know out of this, the ones that are bolded, ascending aorta to aortic arch. You also want to know everything above those as well. The brachiocephalic artery, right subclavian artery, right common carotid artery, left common carotid artery, and left subclavian artery. Again, you need to know where they go to. Again, subclavians go to the arms, left and right. Common carotids go to the brain and face, left and right. Again, the thoracic aorta is above the diaphragm. Below the diaphragm, you have the abdominal aorta. Okay, so below the diaphragm, the first big branch you have of the aorta is the celiac trunk. Again, the celiac trunk has three vessels coming off of it. Kind of the, I guess, 2 o'clock position, if you're looking at it, is the left gastric artery. The other large artery that comes off at about 4 o'clock is the splenic artery, and the one that's coming out at about 9 o'clock is the common hepatic artery. Again, common hepatic goes to the liver and a part of the stomach. Splenic goes to the spleen, and the left gastric, just like it sounds, goes to the left part of the stomach. The renal artery connects the kidneys. The superior mesenteric and inferior mesenteric arteries go out to the small intestines. And here I took the opportunity to talk about mesentery as well, and just kind of refresh our memories. Hopefully in first semester, first week last semester, we learned about the serous membranes, and if you remember the visceral and parietal peritoneum, the membrane that lines the abdomen, the parietal peritoneum comes off the back wall, becomes a dual-layered mesentery for some distance, and then becomes visceral peritoneum as it surrounds and encapsulates the small intestine or large intestine, whatever organ we're looking at. That dual-layered peritoneum has got blood vessels that pass through it, blood vessels, lymph nodes, nerves, things like that, and it goes through all the length of the small intestines. That is mesentery proper. So the superior mesenteric artery and inferior mesenteric artery go into that mesentery to basically feed the small intestine and large intestine. And we think what the blood that comes back out of that is going to be oxygen poor, but it's going to be nutrient rich. So again, kind of looking beyond the aorta, splits in a left and right common iliac, which as we go on to the leg, we'll see split into the each side, left and right, split into the internal and external iliac arteries as well. So again, going off from the arm, we've got a right common carotid. We've got the brachiocephalic trunk right there, splitting into the right common carotid and a right subclavian artery. Again, subclavian turns into the axillary as you pass under the scapula into the axillary region. That also turns into the brachial artery once you get into the arm. Once you pass the antecubital fossa at the elbow, the brachial artery splits into a radial artery and an ulnar artery. So when we talk about pulse points next week, we're looking for a radial pulse at the distal end of that radial artery just underneath the thumb. Again, think about the bones that underlie that. The radial artery is on the radial side, the ulnar artery obviously is on the ulnar side. You should know those on the models in the lab as well. So remember, we've got the plastic arm and leg model. You should know those, be able to find those on the model. So again, following the distal aorta, splits into left and right common iliac arteries. So those go down into the pelvis. The common iliac quickly splits into the internal and external iliac on each side. The external iliac crosses anterior to the pelvis and off to the leg. The internal iliac goes into feeds the organs of the pelvis. So crossing the leg, as soon as the external iliac crosses the pelvis, it is known as the femoral artery, and it passes from very anterior to very posterior. So you're looking at anterior to the pelvis, superficially or superiorly, and inferiorly or distally. the artery kind of turns back and becomes in behind the knee, basically, and it is evident in the popliteal fossa, and then turns into the popliteal artery. Distal to the knee, you've got both anterior and posterior branches. So you have an anterior tibial artery, a posterior tibial artery, and a fibular artery. Again, you should kind of be able to label the ones that you can find on the model as well. Oh, the other one I wanted to mention is out of this lab is a dorsalis pedis artery. Again, we look at pulse points next week. The dorsalis pedis is an easy one to find. There's a pulse point on the top of the foot, and again, that is a distal branch of the anterior tibial artery. So you should know the general layout of where the abdominal aorta and the inferior vena cava kind of lie with each other. The abdominal aorta is on the right side. The inferior vena cava is kind of on the left side. Um, the Again, kind of look at the relationship of the vessels between the kidneys. So what I mentioned here in lab I mean, this is important to transplant nephrologists, because when you look at the kidneys, the kidney on the left side has a longer renal vein than the kidney on the right side. So that was very important clinically. You needed to acquire some special, so a little bit of extra vessels if you're doing a right renal vein or a right kidney transplant. If you got the left kidney, you had all the vein you need. So it is surgically important and things like that as well. Likewise, you see the distal follow the aorta, the right-left common iliacs, as well as the internal and external iliacs. So while I typically just ask you arteries, you do oftentimes have veins that mimic the arteries in their names and layout. So one of the few venous systems I want you guys to look at, we'll talk about later on in the digestive system as well, but it's important to kind of talk about here since we're looking at blood vessels and the flow of blood. So the superior mesenteric artery went out to the small intestines and large intestines, which you see part of here, returning back through the superior mesenteric vein. And eventually all the veins from everything from the spleen, the pancreas, large intestine, small intestine, stomach, eventually all those veins dump into the hepatic portal vein. Now, what you want to know about a portal system is a capillary bed connected to another capillary bed with no pump between, with no heart in between. So you've got the capillary beds of the small intestines and the large intestines fed through the superior and inferior mesenteric arteries. Again, capillary bed, the blood goes back into the superior mesenteric vein, splenic vein, etc., and eventually dumps into the hepatic portal vein. So it's telling you it's already been through a capillary system. There's no pump between, and it's going to go to another capillary system within the liver. So while that blood that just is leaving the intestines has dropped off its oxygen and is oxygen poor, it is nutrient rich. So all that blood that has absorbed nutrients in your GI tract, possibly toxins, all that blood passes through your liver first before it is just dumped into your body, so that fats and energy can be stored. Enzymes can be made to detoxify poisons that you may have ingested, things like that. So the hepatic portal vein is something we'll talk about with the liver. The liver has two blood supplies coming in. It has the hepatic portal vein that is oxygen poor but nutrient rich, and has the hepatic artery, which has the oxygen that the liver cells need. So it's kind of a unique system, but since we're looking at blood vessels, it's important to kind of look at now. So just be aware that portal system and what that actually means.